In the hot seat today, we have Muslim activist Dr. Salman Butt. He is a PhD in biochemistry, and whilst at university, he was the president of his Islamic Society. Presently, he is the chief editor at Islam 21C, a large online Muslim publication. He is launching a legal challenge against the government for deeming him as an extremist speaker. Our interview today is going to be around his legal challenge, but then also we will talk about the notion of extremism, radicalisation, and the prevent strategy, particularly with a focus around the university scene here in the UK. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Salman Butt. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Could you tell us a bit about yourself? What was your journey up to being editor at Islam 21C?
Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. During my time at university, I became increasingly involved in Islamic society, Islamic dawah and activism. And I was a part of the Islamic Society. I was the chair there for a while, and I joined the Federation of Islamic Societies, FOSIS. And this made me increasingly more aware of important issues surrounding Muslim community and Muslim experience in Britain. And after I graduated, I wanted to put the skills that I learned into such areas. So I jumped at the opportunity to join Islam 21C.
You were mentioned specifically by name on a press release by the Home Office as being on a list of speakers that were deemed to be, I quote, on record, expressing views contrary to British values. And the government was insinuating that you shouldn't be speaking at university campuses because of that. Is this a correct label for you?
Well, the problem with labels such as extremist and the government's definition as speaking against British values, so-called British values, is that it is broad enough to apply to almost anyone, and it's presented in the iconography, the kind of rhetoric of ISIS and terrorism and political violence. So it's a very lazy definition. It's a very problematic definition, as many people have and are continuing to bring up. And my name being smeared with this accusation is actually subject to litigation at the moment. So we're pursuing a legal case against the government for this.
So what is actually the definition that the government uses for extremism?
The definition in the Prevent Duty guidance that the government has published is something along the lines of vocal or active opposition to so-called British values, which they give a few examples of, such as democracy, the rule of law, and tolerance of other faiths and religions. So the problem with this is it's arbitrarily applied on people, and we argue on Muslims disproportionately and unfairly. These values, they're not specifically British. These are values which many nations, many human beings across the globe regard as values. But the problem with using so-called opposition to certain values as some kind of criterion is these values are almost like slogans sometimes. The actual concretization of these values, implementing them in real life, and putting different values together and juggling different values, that is a very subjective process, and so nobody is going to openly say I'm against justice or I'm against tolerance.
So is the government making the accusation against you that you are oppose, for example, mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths, individual liberty, the rule of law, democracy? Is that what they mean when they say that you're someone who expresses views contrary to British values?
I'd like to know myself. I mean, this was part of the reason why we've launched a legal case for us to actually see why the government has smeared me and other people with this.
Can I ask you specifically, what was it that the government particularly took offence to, and what led to this label being addressed to you?
Well, I asked my Member of Parliament, Fiona McTaggart, to ask the Home Office this question, and she actually, beyond her expectations, she actually did receive a reply. And there were a few things which were smears against me, which were untrue, but the only true thing that they actually highlighted as an excuse for naming me as an extremist was that I shared a platform with Cage a few years ago, an advocacy group, which I would happily do any day of the week.
There were some specific articles and specific social media posts, weren't they?
Yes, I mean, they mentioned in their correspondence that there were some specific articles and social media posts and so forth, but we're still waiting to find out what that actual evidence for the accusation is from.
Okay, and well, do you accept their allegation that Islam 21C as a host actually contains material that is contrary to British values?
Not according to my own interpretation of British values, but we want to be in a position where, even if it did, we should nurture and inculcate this an atmosphere where people can challenge ideas in a respectable manner, without descending into insults or silencing people. That's how you learn as a society.
I can understand your apprehension regarding this, especially with the use of the definition broadly. But surely we can trust the government to apply it in a fair and balanced way with the required due diligence.
I mean, I'd like to in an ideal world, but in the system we have today, it's important to have a strong civil society holding the government to account and, monitoring the way the government is using these terms. And unfortunately, over the last 10 years or so, we've seen a great contradiction in the way these labels are applied to non-Muslims compared to Muslims. For doing pretty much the same thing. So,
and do you have any examples of that?
I mean, whenever a non-Muslim commits a crime, for example, or an act of antisocial act, it's seen as it should be as an isolated incident. Unfortunately, when a Muslim appears to do something very similar, it's unfortunately often spun within a national security context, as it's usually pieced together some kind of grand Islamist ideological kind of connection to events happening thousands of miles away. And unfortunately, this type of apparent double standard has permeated all levels of society. So we see, for example, in the way the then Home Secretary Theresa May treated the cases of Gary McKinnon and Talha Ahsan. They both committed or are alleged to have committed similar crimes. They both suffer from Asperger's syndrome, and they were both asked to be extradited to the United States. Now, in the former, the Gary McKinnon case, the Home Secretary rightly stepped in and said that would be a violation of his rights. But unfortunately for Talha Ahsan, not only did she fail to protect him from being extradited, but it was used as some kind of victory, some kind of evidence to show how tough, the Home Office is on so-called Islamic extremism.
But surely the government needs to do something about extremism, radicalization, and the threat of terror in this country. What should they be doing if not enacting policies like this?
Well, I think the main thing to bear in mind is the lumping together of these words, extremism, radicalization, and terrorism. When it comes to actual terrorism, this is a crime. Okay, we have more than enough legislation and powers for the state to intervene and to actually prevent and prosecute actual acts of terrorism, because these are crimes. And the criminal justice system is more than capable of dealing with these cases. The problem is bringing in these woolly words like radicalisation and extremism, because I believe the government should not be in the place of silencing ideas, especially if they're not credibly going to harm anyone or lead to an actual crime.
But what the government says is it's these ideas that cause extremism in their viewpoint, that then go ahead to fuel radicalization and terrorism. You have to understand that point of view.
Absolutely, and this is where the government fails miserably when trying to actually put a case forward, showing the science behind this claimed causal link between so-called radical ideas and harmless ideas and actual acts of violence and political violence and terrorism.
So are you saying that the government's wrong when they say that ideas that are contrary to British values as they define it lead to terror and extremism?
Absolutely. I mean, the overwhelming majority of the academic literature, the peer-reviewed academic literature, which is based on empirical studies of cases of terrorism, of cases of political violence for the last few decades, conclude with reasonable accuracy, with reasonable strength and cogent arguments, that a person's ideology, a person's political views are incidental rather than causative when it comes to political violence. Okay, so what's unfortunately happened is the last 10 to 15 years of popular counterterrorism rhetoric and media reports and even policy surrounding this, most of it has been based on this discredited theory called the conveyor belt theory, which is basically, it says a person starts off as a normal person and then somehow gets radicalized into an ideology which then goes on to cause that person to commit acts of violence.
So you're saying that these aren't causative. Then what causes someone to go ahead and commit an act of terror if it's not the extremist kind of radicalization?
That's an excellent question, and this is a question which unfortunately is happening in social studies departments, in criminology departments, in anthropology departments all over the world. But the research, the results of this research are largely being ignored by certain sectors of the government and the media establishment. And naturally there's going to be a lag. There's always a lag between what happens in the academy or what happens in laboratories and public policy. And we hope that the government and society at large understands that this is a highly flawed theory, to presume that somebody's ideology, somebody's beliefs mechanically somehow cause them to pick up a gun and murder someone, when in doing so not only are we looking at the wrong place to prevent actual acts of violence, we're in fact ignoring the actual causes, the actual empirically determined causes of political violence: despair, anger, a sense of alienation, a sense of not belonging, socialization into an in-group, a group with shared kind of anger and resentment towards wider society. There's a lot of academic research done on this, and it's my hope that this legal case that we're fighting will actually force the government, force policymakers to shun ideologically charged think tanks and so forth who are advising government policy on this, and instead of that turn towards the vast body of peer-reviewed academic literature on this.
Sorry, just to be clear then, what you're saying is that it's not ideology that drives radicalization, extremism, terrorism, whatever it is you want to call it, but rather you're saying it's other factors separate from ideology.
As main drivers, we're not saying ideology is non-existent. Ideology is important for a group identity, is important as a post facto justification for a person. Everyone has some kind of language through which they express themselves, through which they try and justify to themselves and to wider society actions, courses of actions that they're taking. If a Muslim happens to do it, then he will or she will use Islamic terminology, metaphors, iconography, Islamic ethics, because that's what they know. If it's a Christian, such as in the Lord's Resistance Army or the FARC, or even the KKK, for example, then they will use that terminology and that imagery and that ethic to justify their violence and their actions. What we need to do is not look at this justification and try and divert all our resources on that, but look at the actual root causes that are pushing the people into the state of despair, the state of anger, the state of pushing themselves towards political violence. Because if a person doesn't find a justification from one Islamic cleric or whatever, he or she will just keep going, and unfortunately until they find some way to justify what they already feel like doing. We shouldn't be focusing so many resources on the justification, but rather the actual stopping people wanting to cause harm to people and so forth.
The government's very specific now. What they say is it's not about reducing the freedom of speech. In fact, they say that this will be protected, but they say it is about taking away the oxygen that radical ideas may need to flourish and to protect young minds.
If there's anything history has shown us, it's that so-called radical ideas need to be heard in society. That the cure to speech you don't like is not to silence it, but to try and challenge it. Sometimes if you don't like somebody's speech, it might feel, you might want to, silence them because, you want to win the argument that way. But if you really believe in your own values, if you really believe in your own position, why not refute those ideas that you don't like on an equal footing, on a fair platform? When it comes to political radical views, okay, from anything from left-wing radicals and nationalist radicals or whatever, if history has shown us anything, it's that when they experience state suppression, that's when a small minority of them actually turn towards violence. We've seen this with the provisional IRA. We've seen this with the anarchist bombings in Paris over a century ago, and we've seen this even in the anti-war student movements in the USA against the Vietnam War. When they felt that the government or the state was suppressing their right to freely challenge something that they felt passionately about, that's when a very small minority of them turn towards violence. So even if the government wants to argue that certain preachers are preaching radical views, the evidence shows us that in order to keep everyone safe, we have to provide a space for these so-called radical views to be expressed, for people to feel that their voices are heard, and if necessary, challenged publicly and challenged openly. The worst thing for this is to suppress it and to drive it underground and to make, in this case, Muslims feel that they are unable to express themselves in the society they call home.
Before the government came up with the Prevent strategy, surely Muslims had the opportunity to air their thoughts and ideas openly. Why did political violence still happen at that time?
Well, let's look at any examples of when Muslims did engage in political violence, or some Muslims did engage in political violence. The only example I can think of is 7/7, which had very little to do with university campuses, very little to do with some kind of religious indoctrination. It was to do with anger, young, foolish people being angry. In this case, at the Iraq War, many people felt angry that millions of people marched in the streets of London. And again, if many people feel that they're not being listened to, a very small minority of them may turn towards violence if they're foolish enough to do that. But that doesn't negate or invalidate the concerns of the majority of people with regards to these tragic events.
A lot of terrorist-related offences nowadays, in recent history, have involved students or people who've just come out of university. I mean, we've got Errol Insadal, who's a law student at London South Bank University. You've got Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, who tried to bomb a passenger flight to Detroit in 2009 after his time at UCL. Aqsa Mahmood, the radiography student. You've got...
Let me stop you there. It's well known that there are these a handful of examples of Muslim people who happened to have been at university, then went on to commit some kind of crime later on in life. We have to look. There are many issues with what you just said. Firstly, we have to look at statistics. Okay, there are estimated upwards of 130,000 Muslim students in the United Kingdom. Just because 4 of them or 5 of them commit some kind of crime after they left university, that in no shape or form represents some kind of causal link. Secondly, to say that there are a significant number of terrorism cases involving Muslims who went to university, it says more actually about the way this definition of terrorist incident is designated to different people. Unfortunately, you'll see it's applied disproportionately to Muslims, despite doing similar crimes, if not crimes of a lesser degree, to their non-Muslim counterparts. If we look at, for example, the cases of Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebowale, the killers of Lee Rigby, that was seen explicitly as a terrorist incident, whereas the case of Thomas Mayer, it was who for explicitly stated political reasons, brutally murdered MP Joe Cox. He was not regarded as a terrorist, nor was his case dealt with under anti-terror legislation, but rather under the criminal justice system. So there is this problem of designation of the word terrorist and terrorism disproportionately to Muslims that actually skews the way we look at these things.
The government also takes issues with gender segregation at universities. I know this is something that's practiced by a lot of Islamic societies. What the government is insinuating is that gender segregation leads to a mindset which is extremist in nature. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely not. And the reason is this is an error carried forward, a result of building policy surrounding so-called radicalisation and terrorism on such fictitious grounds, and that is that ideology causes terrorism. If somebody has taken this as a premise, then in order to prevent terrorism, they're going to create policies and create police procedures to actually identify expressions of ideology, to somehow predict that this person is at risk of becoming a terrorist one day. And when they do that, this is when we begin to see these farcical headlines that a child asking for a prayer room was forwarded to some kind of prevent program. A person asking for separate seating for men and women at an event or something. This is somehow spun into through the lens of national security and terrorism and so forth, because people are looking in absolutely the wrong place for signs that somebody might be so-called radicalized or might be going down a path towards violence.
I guess you don't agree with the ex-Prime Minister David Cameron when he said that all institutions have a role in rooting out and challenging extremism. And the university's minister, under his instruction at that time, Joe Johnson, he applied pressure on the NUS, he applied pressure on the business secretary to communicate with the Higher Education Funding Council to monitor universities and to make sure that Prevent is implemented in universities. You think that that's not warranted?
The Prevent policy, almost in totality, not only is it useless in that it looks in the wrong places when it comes to trying to prevent acts of violence, but it's also counterproductive in that it has there is good reason to believe that it has increased the suspicion towards the Muslim community, that it actually alienates young Muslims, and it makes them feel that they're unable to express themselves without being getting in trouble with the law and so forth.
Do you think then the real issue is that Islamic values are fundamentally incompatible with British values? Is this why, as you say, mainstream Muslim speakers continuously fall into the government's definition of extremists? Do you think that's the real problem?
I mean, it's true that mainstream speakers are in the crosshairs, so to speak, and are continually smeared as extremists. But I don't think it's because of some kind of fundamental clash between Islamic and British values.